Technology is not my friend. Normal laptop not really working. Swapped it for another laptop. Brought it home and it doesn't want to record any videos. So now I'm on my phone, which has got a much better camera. So I'm kind of up close and regretting it, really. Anyway, the idea is 2, maybe even 3 chapters today. So chapter 18. You can do it, brother. I think we know what's going to happen, don't we? Okay. It was autumn. The procession on the river was headed by a washing tub drawn by 6 geese. Men swam behind it. All the barges and lighters were decorated with flags and flowers and white rags that fluttered like the feathers of swans. Some of the men were being rolled down the river in barrels, to hoots of laughter. The banks were lined with watchers all dressed in bright rags and shiny coats, playing bugles and beating drums. A family of beggars was singing hymns, and the tiny voices of the children piped like birds. It was the miners' pageant, and the Lily drifted along in the procession, freed from work for the day. Nick and his fellows shouted to each other and sang. Remember at the end of the previous chapter, he cried because of the brush that he had, possibly with death. Drawn up among the watching people were some painted wagons. 2 clowns stood with mournful faces, holding up a green and crimson banner. Juglini's Champion Circus, Nick read out. What's a circus? Jim wanted to ask, but wouldn't. The showman's family came out of their wagon to watch. The man and the woman each carried a child, and older children danced around them. A boy of Jim's age did a handstand and waggled his feet at the barges. Jim waved to him, and the boy dropped down, waved, and swung up again. See, the voice in his head said, another brother, Jim. They're all over the place, aren't they? For a time, as the procession sailed past, the circus boy ran alongside the Lily, waving and shouting, Come to the circus! Come to the circus! He shouted, then fell back as the crowd became thicker. Jim cupped his hand round his mouth. I will! He shouted back. They were nearing another village. Jim stood up and strained to keep the boy in sight. He could hear the circus band, the roll of drums, the tooting of trumpets and trombones. He imagined he could still hear the boy's voice. The main point of the pageant seemed to be for the coalmen and lightermen to pull up at every village and visit the local alehouse and get as drunk as possible on their pageant money. Grimy Nick lurched and stumbled with the rest of them, and his singing became louder and more slurred. He stowed his long oar inside the hold and laughed down at Jim's excited face. Want to go pageanting, do you? Please, Nick. Can I? Nick whistled in his scornful way and stumped off. Jim watched him go, hating him. He crouched down by Snipe, fingering the rope round his neck. Night was settling down on the water, though it was still warm. Families were gathered on the banks and children were being called together by their mothers. They eyed him curiously as they went past and whispered to each other, their hands across their mouths. Jim knew they were laughing at him. What are you doing here? The voice in his head asked him, tied up like an animal, eating and sleeping like an animal, no one to talk to. Time you went. Time you skipped away, brother, and no mistake. He stood up. Snipe snarled at him. Jim thought about his lucky chance at the workhouse when he'd decided to escape with the carpets, how he'd leapt at it, how well it had worked. If he'd managed that time, he'd manage again. His last attempt had been reckless. He'd jumped without thinking. He'd be mad to think of taking a chance like that again. But this time his thoughts were calm and steady. He wasn't going to leap at anything, but he was going to get away. He knew that. By the time night was out, he knew Grimy Nick would be drunker than he'd ever been before. It was Jim's perfect chance. He knew exactly what to do. While he waited, he lowered himself down into the hold and found some big heavy chunks of coal. He carried them up onto the boards and hid them. Then he found a small, sharp piece. He ran his hand along the edge of it. Just right. He laid the boards down across the coamings till they covered the hold completely except for the small hatch board. Then he took the piece of sharp coal and rubbed it against the rope that was round his neck. It seemed to take hours. He thought the rope would never begin to fray, but all at once he felt the strands fluffing up and begin to weaken. His wrist was aching. If Nick came while he was doing it, he thought, he'd just put his head down and pretend to sleep. It was only a matter of time now. The rope had to give. Bursts of sound erupted on the river and from the village. Jim worked on, scraping and scraping at the rope. It had to give. At last he was through. The last slice of the coal cut his neck as the final strand snapped, but he didn't care. He held the frayed end in his hand and edged up to Snipe, careful not to startle him. The dog opened his yellow eyes and growled. "It's all right, Snipe, it's all right." He forced himself to stroke the dog's matted fur. Again, Snipe growled. Jim kept on stroking him and talking to him softly, all the time listening out for Grimy Nick. At last, he judged the dog to be calm enough. He slipped the rope round Snipe's neck and secured it. Good. Then he heard Nick coming back, singing and stumbling along the riverbank. It didn't matter. Jim had a plan for that. When Nick lumbered on deck, he raised the lantern and saw his boy and his dog sleeping side by side, the boy with his hand on the dog's neck. He was touched by their peacefulness. He tried to keep past them, lost his footing and tumbled into his hold. Jim and Snipe both strained their ears, listening. Almost at once, Nick's breathing steadied into a rumbling snore. For a long time, Jim waited. On shore, all the voices had quietened down. The hens and dogs, the cows and pigs in all of the backyards of all the villages had settled in for the night. Jim stirred slowly. Snipe half woke. Jim sat for a bit and then sidled his way to the hold. He watched the dog till it sank its head back into its paws. "Come on, you can do it, brother, you can." And he knew that he could. Slowly, he stood up, took hold of the hatch cover and lowered it down. The dog slept on. One by one, and taking what seemed to be an eternity over it, he lifted up the big chunks of coal that he had brought earlier, and without making a sound, placed them on the hatch. He worked slowly and steadily, and still the dog slept. Then he straightened himself up. Nothing moved, not a sound. He crept over to the side of the deck, glanced quickly round at the dog, and with one swift movement rolled himself off the lighter and onto the bank. He righted himself and began to run. Chapter 19. Away. Instantly, Snipe was awake. His howls rang across the night. He strained to pull against the rope in a fury to be free. Grimy Nick hollered himself into wakefulness and pummelled his fists against the hatch. Across the fields, all the backyard animals sent up their clamour. Lights blazed across the water. Jim sprinted on steadily, head down, dodging between bushes and trees. He could hear his own breathing and the flapping of his boot soles. Brambles tore at his breeches and his jacket. An overhanging branch snapped at his cap and held it trapped, and Jim had to run back and tear it free. He loped on, his chest tight and bursting, his legs as heavy as lead weights. He had no idea where he was going. He heard rustling in the undergrowth behind him and knew that he was being followed. The rustling became a snuffling and panting. It was a dog. Jim's leg hurt so much now that he couldn't run any further. In total weariness, he flung himself down, head first, covered his face with his hands and waited for Snipe to spring. He was aware that everything had gone silent again, as if the world had sunk back into sleep. At last he made himself turn his head. The dog was not Snipe at all, but a small terrier. He licked Jim's outstretched hand and ran away again through a hedge. There wasn't a sound. If Snipe still howled, he couldn't be heard from here. If Nick still hammered and swore, then the noise he made was lost in the night. "What if they're dead, brother?" the voice crept into his head. "What if old Nick's suffocating down there in the hold? What if Snipe strangled himself on their rope?" He sat up, drenched with cold sweat. "What if you've killed them?" He trusted himself to stand up. There wasn't a sound. He whistled softly for the dog, who padded back through the hedge to him, ran up and then danced away. He was alone again, and this time it was the silence that made him afraid. He crawled into the hedge, hoping to sleep, but the silence boomed around him. "Now you've done it," the little voice whispered. "You've left your master to suffocate, and you've strangled his dog on the rope. You've killed them both, you have. Now you're for it, Jim." Do you think that's really what's happened? I think it's his conscience and the fear of being free. The fact that almost being trapped there had become his security. It's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? There'll be more later.